You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club and World Affairs. I'm Ray Suarez.
Prepare on deck for rescue.
They came from Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan, Nigeria and Eritrea. They traveled across North Africa seeking safety, like 34-year-old Teklia Zumi.
It's already 6 years I have never seen my family.
Teklia Zumi fled Eritrea on the Horn of Africa in 2016.
I was a teacher for elementary school and junior school, and also for 5 years I was a director of a school. But unfortunately, it is bad situation in Eritrea, as we know. Political situation, economic situation, everything is bad.
Zumi left his wife and 3 young daughters to join hundreds of thousands of people trying to make it to Europe.
From Ethiopia to Libya is by paying money. From Sudan to Libya, from Sahara, it is very bad situation to be. We were 68 together in one lorry. It's no food, no water. We have taken 21 days. We paid $4,000.
And then several $1,000s more to cross the Mediterranean.
The boat was made from wood, and we were 110 totally.
Zumi says they traveled for about 8 hours overnight, and in the morning,
the Italian Coast Guard have come and checked photo. They recognize who we are. So directly they called the Libyan Coast Guard,
which took the passengers to detention centers in Libya.
So we have in jail in Libya for 2 years. 1 year and 4 months, we have never seen sunlight. We have never seen any fresh air. It's closed and dark.
Zumi contracted tuberculosis and nearly died.
Even when I sleep, I remember in my mind, I'm dreaming, I have nightmare every day.
He ultimately made it to Sweden via Rwanda in 2020.
I'm so lucky to be safe. So hopefully I wish to other my friends who are still suffering in Libya to be safe like me. More than 5 years they are still now in Libya.
And so Zumi prays for his wife and daughters who are still in Eritrea, and for his friends still held in Libyan detention camps. During his more than 2.5 years in Libyan detention, Zumi managed to contact Irish journalist Sally Hayden, but he was not the first. Another man held in detention like Zumi had sent her a Facebook message in August of 2018. It said, "Sister Sally, we need your help. We're in a bad condition in Libyan prison. If you have time, I will tell you all the story." And Sally wrote back.
I responded, I said, "I don't know that I can help, but I can talk to you, tell me what's going on."
Hello, Sally. I'm from Zintan Detention Center.
Sally, do you hear that one?
People in Libyan detention camps began to call Hayden, pleading for help.
Yeah, I would like to give you some information about
everything. This is no good beside for Libya.
The war is
they are under infected.
Like yesterday.
We don't have food
Today
or
also.
water to drink. Our twins, they are very in bad conditions. Their world child make mercy.
Sally Hayden's book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, is a grim and gripping read in a world desensitized to the desperation of so many people fleeing war, oppression, and grinding poverty. Sally takes us behind the headlines to explain what it's like to be a refugee. She demands accountability from fellow Europeans who've stopped giving a damn. Sally, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start in 2015? More than 1 million people applied for asylum in Germany. It's the height of the refugee crisis that summer. Angela Merkel said 3 famous words, "Wir schaffen das," we can manage it. Can you take us back to that moment in time when Germany and to some extent the rest of Europe was welcoming refugees? Why did that initial enthusiasm fade?
Like you said, it is true that there was a time when it was seeming like there was going to be a more empathetic policy. Having said that, I mean, the kind of sad irony of claiming refugee status is that you most generally have to get onto the territory of the safe country to be able to then claim your right to be in it. And so even at that time, you still had people making very dangerous journeys. You still had large numbers of people dying. But yeah, you're right. Once they got to Europe, there was at least a brief time when it seemed like they would be welcomed. There were a lot of initiatives being made to welcome people, even welcoming parties, people going out with banners, refugees welcome, all of this. Things shifted quite quickly, and I think we've had like a few moments in the last decade where there has been an outpouring of sympathy. One of those times was the death of Alan Kurdi in 2015, the little Syrian boy who drowned and his body was pictured on the Turkish coast. And then, yeah, things changed pretty quickly again. You had right-wing, kind of far-right groups latching onto this idea of immigration or of even refugees arriving being something that they could use to, you know, speak out against and kind of gain more power. And then you had the centrist politicians who became scared that they were going to lose that power. And like we saw, like Brexit, like the election of Donald Trump, even though that was in the US, that were all kind of linked to this backlash against refugees arriving, or the idea of immigration. But what that led to was the people who would have been more sympathetic also adopting policies that meant that it was much harder for refugees who were trying to reach safety in Europe to actually even arrive there.
In recent years, we've seen the number of refugees reaching the shores of Europe collapsing. This has reduced that political pressure on European governments you're talking about. But your reporting found these shrinking numbers hide another story, a really horrific story.
This has never really been a crisis of Europe. This has been a crisis of people fleeing dictatorships or wars or, you know, horrific situations who are trying to seek safety. And those situations haven't gone away. But what has changed is Europe effectively cementing its borders, you know, getting this nickname Fortress Europe. And initially that involved doing a deal with Turkey to effectively try and get the Turkish government involved in stopping departures from Turkish shores. And that's the Eastern Mediterranean route. But then what I focus on is it's called the Central Mediterranean route. It's people leaving North Africa to get to Europe. So Italy or Malta, they generally arrive in. And so what happened there instead was that the EU began training and equipping the Libyan Coast Guard from 2017 to effectively intercept boats of refugees and push them back into Libya to indefinite detention.
And then those refugees are not returned to their home countries. They're trapped in horrendously overcrowded prisons.
Yes, and it's been harder there to do a deal because the country is kind of run by militias and it's split between opposing sides. And I think it's very important to emphasize here there isn't a legal process. This isn't being put in prison because you've been charged with something. This is literally just indefinite detention with no legal process, no route out, no charge, no trial, no lawyer. So people are being locked up. Like close to 90,000 now men, women and children since 2017 have been intercepted on the Mediterranean Sea, the Central Mediterranean, and most of them locked up indefinitely in Libya in detention centres that have actually been compared to concentration camps. You know, the conditions inside them are horrific. There's torture, starvation, pretty much every kind of abuse you can imagine.
Can you describe some of these conditions? The passages in the book are just jaw-dropping.
In the book, I didn't even manage to describe all the detention centres where I was in touch with people because the number that are open kind of changes. So there's like the government-aligned detention centres, so-called official detention centres, which are associated with the UN-backed government in Tripoli, the capital of Libya. And that number shifts a little bit. Like at one stage it was 26, 24, you know, they close, they open, they're run by militias effectively. So the militia might fall out with the government, so they lose their official status. There are also unofficial ones where people are also taken in ransom. You know, in some it's more common that there's maybe starvation even as a means of punishment or restriction to water. Some are further from the capital city and it's hard to get healthcare, so people die of medical neglect effectively. Others are being used as military bases, so the detainees there might get forced to help, if there's fighting with a war effort, or even be taken out as slave labor, like to work on farms, to work in the houses of wealthy militia leaders, things like that.
Explain, if you can, how it is that European dollars are funding some of this abuse.
Basically, I think we have to go back a bit in time to 2015 and something called the EU Trust Fund for Africa. So again, we had 2015, the year of, the so-called migrant crisis. And one of the ideas that the EU came up with was this multi-billion euro or dollar pot of money that they were going to spend across 26 African countries. And this effectively was to stop migration, but it goes into a range of different initiatives, One of the terms that we'll hear a lot is migration management. And there's a lot of kind of jargon used that slightly disguises exactly what's being done here. Another thing that's discussed a lot is fighting smuggling and trafficking. So in terms of the Libyan Coast Guard themselves, a lot of the discussion was, or the official rhetoric was, saving lives at sea. And that money, it can be spent on training, equipment. They kind of say they're doing human rights training. But then there's also a really massive amount of money being spent on the UN, particularly on the United Nations agencies, the UN Refugee Agency and the International Organization for Migration. And that money, again, then gets channeled through they're called partner organizations, like smaller NGOs. So in terms of how captivity has kind of been monetized, it's not so clear-cut as the EU is directly paying militias, so much as it's that there's like a lot of money being spent on this whole system. And some of the discussion around that is, that they're trying to improve the detention centres. So when you speak to EU officials, they'll answer that they don't agree with the detention centre system and they're trying to improve the conditions through the UN. But then when you look further at where that money is being spent, when you talk to the refugees themselves, they say that money is, it might be spent on a big catering contract, for example, but then you find out that the caterer is actually owned by one of the Libyan government officials who seems to be profiting from it. So it's not so clear-cut as like the EU is paying the militias, but there's like a lot of money pumping in that's then finding its way in different means to militias. And I've spoken to a lot of UN staff about this. This is when they speak to you anonymously. They'll say it's impossible to work in Libya without dealing with militias.
Let's listen to more of a message you received from a man held in one of these Libyan detention centers. We heard a little bit from him earlier.
We have been here for long. Since last year, up to this time, no solution. And the soldiers are treating us unfairly. Force us to work. The food that they give us not enough. We need help. We need the world to find solution.
What he was talking about is forced labor. They were being forced to actually work in the detention center, which is quite usual. Like there'll be all types of different work, maybe building, maybe helping soldiers that are fighting. Sometimes they load and offload weapons from vehicles, all sorts of different work.
Western aid agencies are paying attention or maybe barely paying attention, visiting sporadically and often with advance notice. So the groups that run these centers can create an appealing photo opportunity. You write in the book, warehouse operators knew how to clean up for company, like European ambassadors or even nonprofit workers. I'm wondering if you can just talk to that. There's a kind of willing blindness on the part of Western aid agencies.
I think there is an awareness of what's happening, but it's a very controlled situation. And so the interesting thing for me actually was that because I was in touch daily with people who were inside the detention centres, I'd actually kind of be getting advance notice as to where I was going to get a visit. So, for example, someone would message me, they'd say, it's so strange, they've just turned on the electricity and now they're telling us that we can wash ourselves, and now they're saying that we should, which is actually terrible, like move the sick people into like a back room. And then they'd say, I think someone must be coming to visit. And they would then send me messages and say, here's all the things that I couldn't say because I knew if I actually said this thing that I was going to be tortured or I was going to be beaten up. And there are aid agencies that are going in and out. I'm in touch with a lot of aid workers. They would tell me that it's all kind of based on personal relationships because the detention centres are being run by militias. So, for example, one big problem was that, you could have an aid agency saying they're visiting every day, but they would never actually go into the rooms where the refugees were being kept. They'd allow the guards in the detention centre to pick out people to bring to see them. And so they might not actually be seeing the most sick people or the people who needed it the most. And then maybe they would leave and say things are okay there, but actually there would be like the room at the back where they hadn't gone into where the sick people were being hidden.
It's like you're describing a kind of controlled chaos, but you also describe in the book the impact that this has on people who are living in these centers, sometimes for years at a time. Many of them lose their minds.
It's very hard for me to understand, even me having spoken to people for years. They're just sitting in this room, in some cases years, some cases months. And no, you have no idea when you're going to get out, if you're going to get out. In a lot of cases, their only hope, a lot of them had run out of money. Their family couldn't pay smugglers. There's this idea that all refugees, that they want to pay smugglers to use illegal routes. But most people I'm in touch with, they want legal routes to safety. But those legal routes are very, very hard to access. And there were a very small number of people who were chosen for evacuation through the UN Refugee Agency. Many people I spoke to, they would just sit around all day and talk about this evacuation. What are their chances? Are they going to get chosen? Is it going to happen this year? Is it going to happen next year? Will they die before that happens, And that was a very real risk as well because people are dying in the detention centres.
Is there any way to get the business of human transport to Europe out of Libya? Does it have to happen in Libya?
I mean, the thing is that people will find routes, they'll always find routes. And so Libya now has become harder and harder. And now you have a growing number of people who actually get boats, for example, from West Africa to the Canary Islands. That's becoming a growing route now. And the death rate there is really rising. But at the end of the day, people will always find different ways to make these journeys if they're desperate.
Let's talk about the role in all of this of the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. I don't think most Americans even know much about this agency.
Yeah, so the UN Refugee Agency, it's the agency that's mandated to effectively protect refugees, to look out for refugee rights. And it operates in a huge number of countries around the world, granting refugee status, also advocating, its officials will advocate for refugees. Angelina Jolie is one of the most high-profile people who work with them, going on trips, raising awareness of their work. And it's the organisation that organises evacuations and resettlement from Libya, which are a small number, but there are a number of people who get moved out to safe countries. That's what they call the legal route, which is what everybody wants, really.
Whistleblowers regularly canned. If there's a public scandal, an investigation, some scapegoat is given the boot, and the incompetence and corruption continues unabated.
So I started reporting on UNHCR in Sudan, which neighbours Libya. And a lot of the refugees who leave Eritrea, for example, Somalia, even Darfur in Sudan, they go through Sudan, then they go towards Libya. And refugees who end up in Sudan, when I went there in 2017, I was actually meant to be reporting on the EU funding, the Trust Fund for Africa. But what the refugees that I interviewed told me is that UNHCR, which is meant to be doing resettlement from the country, that their staff were arranging, along with middlemen, to take bribes of sometimes tens of thousands of dollars from refugees who wanted to be taken to safety. So I ended up reporting on this in 2018. that was actually kind of how I started reporting on what was happening in North Africa with refugees. I reported that refugees there basically almost were being forced to go to Libya and find these illegal routes, because what they were saying was it was corrupt, that you had to pay money, that it wasn't a fair process, that they didn't have any trust that this agency was looking out for them. And 2 days after I published that, the whole refugee resettlement program was actually suspended while they carried out a anti-corruption probe, which also shocked me because I thought these are vulnerable people. So suspending the whole program, that just punishes them even further. I think eventually they did find one staff member guilty of soliciting bribes and abusing power. But I'm still in touch with refugees there who say, they allege anyway, this situation is continuing.
You know, Sally, I've been so taken with the coverage of the refugees fleeing Ukraine. We retweet photos of their pets. We remark on their families and careers. But the refugees you've been talking to from Africa and the Middle East don't get this presumption that they're hashtag just like us. Many have education. They're athletes, artists, doctors, teachers. But they sort of become personality free in Western media.
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the reasons actually that I wanted to write the book, because when people get trapped in a detention center, I was in touch with, exactly like you say, like athletes, musicians, dentists, doctors, people with all sorts of different backgrounds. But while they're inside that detention center, I actually have to strip them of any kind of unique characteristics, because they literally could be tortured if they got identified as the person who was leaking that information out to the media. And so that was actually quite difficult for me, because I realized that I was playing into this. In one sense, it is dangerous if you're not humanizing people, if you're not giving them kind of characteristics that someone else can relate to. And in another, you don't want them to get tortured. So like, people would send me information about all sorts of things. Please, can you report on this? This person is dying. Can you get them medical help? We're starving. And I would report that. And next thing, there would be guards that go in, do a search of everybody looking for phones. And in some cases, they could directly link that to what I had reported. And at the same stage, they wanted it published because they have no other voice, you know. And I had people saying, well, do they not understand the risk? But they do. They're the ones who are living in that situation, you know.
How much of the horror of this overall situation is basically a function of racial politics in Europe? Too many people who don't want black and brown refugees coming to live with them.
You know, one thing that I found hard actually while I was reporting on this was seeing articles about population decline. And as kind of a side note in these articles, they mentioned that the population of Africa is growing, but it's never seen as like, well, why don't we provide more opportunities to young people in Africa so that they can, that has to be racism, right? I don't know what else it can be. I mean, even I talked to one of my sources, an Eritrean guy, yesterday about the Ukraine situation. And I said, why do you think they're being treated differently? He was like, it's obvious. It's because they're white and we're black. Like, that's the reason.
You know, Sally, let's imagine that somebody is listening to this and saying, gosh, the world is full of horrible governments, corrupt kleptocracies, ecosystems in crisis after centuries of misuse and abuse. Why are those of us lucky enough to be born in better places responsible for taking in everybody else? You're just asking for too much. What do you say to that listener?
For me, I'm a journalist, so I don't see my role as telling people what to do necessarily, but I do think that we need to be aware of what we are responsible of. Like, it's not that people just happen to be in a different country, it's that they're trying to reach safety and they're being intercepted because of the EU, and they're being forced back into indefinite detention. And I write in the book, like, there's lots of arguments about ex-colonies and about how this trust fund money is being spent. But for me, it was like, when I found out about this interception at sea and it's, you know, the direct role that the EU was playing with that, for me, it was like, well, that's the point when, you know, we can't argue that we're not guilty anymore. Like, this is Europeans that are doing this, you know. So I think that people should be aware of the consequences of what their policy is doing. So I kind of saw my role as being to document that.
Before we let you go, I want to close out with a song. I'm wondering if you can set it up for us.
Yeah, it was sent to me from one of the detention centers. Actually, they didn't necessarily understand that they could be intercepted on the sea. Even when they see these boats coming to get them, they think maybe it's European rescue volunteers who are going to greet them and bring them to safety. And instead, they're brought back to this detention center, and they were so morose and so upset. And at that point, they wrote this song.
Well, I want to say thank you, Sally. Thank you for this conversation, and thank you for the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me as well.
Sally Hayden is an award-winning journalist and photographer focused on migration, conflict, and humanitarian crisis. Her new book is My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route. We reached out for comment to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. A spokesperson said that the agency is, quote, painfully aware of the terrible conditions in Libya's detention centers. It has called on the European Union to make support to the Libyan Coast Guard conditional on ending the use of detention centers for people rescued at sea. Additionally, UNHCR says it conducts awareness campaigns on the dangers of traveling through Libya.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, Polly Stryker, Andrew Stelzer, Joanne Jennings, and with help from Rachael Myrow. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Our technical supervisor is Jim Bennett. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.